Today, we're diving into a book that's been a staple in political science for decades. But, its core message really challenges what a lot of us are taught about American democracy. The book is Michael Parenti's Democracy for the Few, and it's a work that is not afraid to ask some pretty uncomfortable questions about who really holds the power in the United States.
And this, right here, is the question that drives the entire book. It just cuts through all the political noise and gets right to the point. In a system supposedly for the people, who does it actually serve? And that's the question we're going to try to unpack today by digging into the book's arguments. So, here's our game plan for breaking this all down. We're going to start with the conventional view of democracy, the one we're all pretty familiar with. Then we'll get into the book's main argument, trace its logic back to the Constitution, follow the money into the modern day, and finally, look at the completely different lens this analysis gives us for understanding our world. Let's get into it.
Right off the bat, the book makes a pretty bold claim that the way we even study politics is itself a political act. Parenti argues that a lot of standard textbooks and analyses tend to tiptoe around the really tough questions about power and money in the US. This book, it's designed to run straight at them. And this right here, this is the foundational idea of the entire book. Parenti's basically saying that you can't possibly understand the political system if you don't understand the economic system it's sitting in this case, corporate capitalism. This connection, this link between economic power and political power is the main thread we're going to be pulling on throughout this whole explainer. So to build its case, the book first lays out what it calls the idealized version of American government. And this is probably the one you and I learned back in our civics classes. It's that familiar framework that serves as the jumping-off point for the book's much deeper critique. You know the drill, right? This view paints a picture of a really balanced, pluralistic system. It's the idea that the Constitution keeps power in check, that our voices get heard when we vote, that no one single group can call all the shots, and that the government is just a neutral referee. This is the conventional model that Democracy for the Few sets out to challenge, piece by piece, arguing that it misses what's really going on beneath the surface.
Okay, so having laid out that standard view, the book then presents its core argument as a direct response. It asks a really powerful what if. What if this system isn't nearly as balanced or as pluralistic as it looks on paper?
And this quote just lays it all out there. Parenti's central thesis is that even with all the democratic processes we have, government policy consistently ends up favoring the interests of the wealthy and privileged, the haves. And often, that comes at the direct expense of the general public, the have-nots. Now, to describe this kind of system, the book uses a very specific and important word, plutocracy. And this isn't just about politicians being rich. No, it's about the whole social order, from the government and laws to the media and cultural institutions being set up in a way that primarily benefits the interests of the wealthy. And to show that this isn't some new radical idea, the book points all the way back to the very beginning, quoting one of the nation's first Supreme Court Chief Justices, John Jay. This quote kind of suggests that from the get-go, there was this understanding that owning the country's wealth gave you the right to run it. This historical angle brings us right to our next section. Let's revisit the Constitution. The book argues that if you really want to understand the system today, you have to go back to the original blueprint and really look at the intentions of the men who wrote it. The book's analysis points out that the guys who wrote the Constitution were, by and large, incredibly wealthy. We're talking merchants, slave owners, land speculators, bankers. There weren't any small farmers or regular workers in the room. So from this perspective, their number one concern wasn't creating a direct democracy, but building a stable republic that would protect their property rights from what they were really afraid of, the tyranny of the majority. And the book uses direct quotes from the Constitutional Convention to back this up. Elbridge Gerry, a delegate from Massachusetts, said what many of his peers were thinking, that pure democracy was a huge threat to stability and property. For them, it was something to be contained, not celebrated. And this really shows you the mood in the room. I mean, from Hamilton's clear distrust of the masses to Sherman wanting to keep them as far away from government as possible, the book argues there was this constant theme of needing to control the will of the people, not empower it. So the big takeaway here is that the framers built in what James Madison called auxiliary precautions. Things like separating powers, checks and balances, and staggered elections. They weren't just about stopping a king from taking over. According to the book, these were also deliberately designed to break up power and make it incredibly difficult for a popular majority to make big, fast changes, especially the kind of changes that might threaten the economic interests of the wealthy few. Okay, so now let's jump from that historical foundation to the modern economic landscape. The book argues that the same patterns set up at the very beginning are still playing out today, leading to an extreme concentration of wealth and, as a result, a ton of political consequences.
To illustrate this concentration of power, the book gives some pretty startling figures. For example, it notes that in the couple of decades before it was published, the 500 largest corporations in the U.S. cut over 5 million jobs. But during that exact same time, their assets more than doubled. The book uses this to highlight a huge disconnect between what's good for a corporation's bottom line and what's good for the wider workforce.
This slide shows a really powerful metaphor the book uses to help us visualize this inequality. Instead of a society with a big, stable middle class, it paints this picture of a super steep, narrow pyramid. The vast majority of people are all clustered down at the bottom, while the wealth of that tiny fraction at the very top just skyrockets to this almost unbelievable height, leaving everyone else way, way below. And here's what that pyramid looks like when you actually put some numbers to it, based on data the book uses. If you look at that bar on the left, the bottom 80% of us, the vast majority of the population, takes home only about 40% of the total national income. Now look at the right bar. The top 20% of earners, they get the other 60%. The book argues this economic reality is what truly shapes our political one. This picture really visualizes the book's argument about government priorities. You see the tax dollars being collected from regular people and then funneled toward military spending, which in turn enriches a select few. The book has a name for this: socialized costs and privatized profits. Basically, a system where the public pays for the costs and the risks, but the profits from all that government spending go back into private hands. And the book is really firm on this point. This economic structure has serious real-world human consequences. It pulls together data showing that despite being an incredibly wealthy country, the U.S. has higher rates of child poverty and housing problems than many other industrialized nations. The main argument here is that these are not just abstract stats. They represent real hardships for millions of people that result from these policy decisions. So all of this brings us to the book's conclusion. But it isn't really a list of policy fixes. It's more of a framework, a different lens for us to look through when we see political events and social problems. In the end, the entire analysis boils down to this one central idea. The book concludes that when economic power is so heavily concentrated in the hands of a few, political power is inevitably going to follow. And this, it argues, fundamentally messes with the democratic ideal that every single citizen's voice should carry the same weight. To leave us with one final, crystallizing thought, the book quotes former Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, who put it so bluntly, "We can have democracy in this country, or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both." That quote just perfectly captures the fundamental choice that democracy for the few spends its entire time exploring. And so the book leaves us with this final, really challenging question. It doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but it forces us to look the dilemma right in the face. By walking us through this deep analysis of history, power, and money, it's really just prompting each of us to think critically about who our democracy really serves and to ask ourselves if great wealth and true democracy can ever really coexist.